Welcome to the Twilight Realm, where Hawkins' deepest secrets unfold like whispered bedtime stories. Tonight, we journey through the complete tapestry of Stranger Things lore. From the government experiments that shattered reality to the children who became humanity's unlikely guardians. Let the gentle rhythm of this chronicle carry you through dimensions of wonder and darkness, where every shadow holds a story and every story holds truth. Rest your mind as we explore the hidden history that shaped a small Indiana town into the epicenter of cosmic horror and heroic love. Close your eyes and drift into the upside down of dreams. The shadows of history stretch far deeper than the neon glow of 1980s nostalgia might suggest, reaching back through decades of governmental ambition and scientific hubris to a moment when the United States Navy attempted to bend reality itself to their strategic advantage. The Philadelphia experiment of 1943 represents the first crack in the foundation of our universe, a hairline fracture that would eventually split wide enough to swallow entire dimensions and transform innocent children into vessels for cosmic horror. The USS Eldridge floated in the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. Like any other destroyer, its steel hull gleaming with the promise of American industrial might turn toward the noble cause of defeating fascism. The sailors who walked her decks could not have imagined that their vessel had been selected for an experiment that would rewrite the fundamental laws of physics and open doorways that should have remained sealed until the heat death of the universe. The force field technology, intended to grant naval ships invisibility, represented humanity's first attempt to weaponize the impossible, to transform theoretical physics into practical military advantage through the application of technologies that existed beyond the boundaries of conventional scientific understanding. Dr. Martin Brenner's father served among the crew of specialists assembled to monitor this unprecedented test, his role as observer placing him at the epicenter of an event that would echo through generations of his family line, like a curse disguised as scientific advancement. The energy device that engulfed the Eldridge operated according to principles that Earth's brightest minds had barely begun to comprehend, drawing power from sources that existed in the spaces between dimensions where normal physical laws held no dominion over matter and energy. When the switch was thrown and the generators reached full capacity, the Eldridge did not simply disappear from visible light spectra as intended. Instead, the entire vessel was torn from our reality and hurled into a parallel dimension that existed alongside our own, like a photograph's negative image, a realm of shadows and decay that would later be designated Dimension X. The hostile environment that greeted the displaced sailors defied every assumption about the nature of alternate realities, presenting not a mirror world of familiar geography, but an alien landscape where predatory intelligences had been waiting since before the formation of galaxies for exactly such an intrusion. The creatures that inhabited Dimension X operated according to biological principles that suggested evolution under conditions where individual consciousness represented not survival advantage, but dangerous deviation from collective unity. The mind flayer that ruled this realm existed as pure thought, distributed across vast networks of interconnected awareness, its understanding of reality shaped by eons of existence. In environments where the concept of selfhood had never emerged to complicate the perfect harmony of the hive mind, the arrival of human consciousness in its domain represented both opportunity and threat, offering new forms of awareness to study and absorb, while introducing the chaos of individual will into systems designed around absolute conformity. Brenner's father witnessed horrors during those hours trapped in Dimension X that human language possessed no adequate vocabulary to describe. His mind forced to process sensory input from an environment where the fundamental constants of reality operated according to different mathematical principles. The particles that comprised the atmosphere of this alien realm carried more than simple chemical information, encoding patterns of thought and memory that began immediately to infiltrate his biological systems through every breath he drew into lungs that were never designed to filter consciousness itself. The few survivors who returned when the Eldridge materialized back in our dimension carried with them more than traumatic memories of their interdimensional experience. The exposure to Dimension X had altered their cellular structure at the genetic level, rewriting portions of their DNA to accommodate the presence of alien particles that continued to circulate through their bloodstreams like microscopic ambassadors from a realm where individual identity represented nothing more than temporary illusion destined for eventual absorption into larger patterns of collective awareness. The blood type changes that medical examinations revealed in the surviving crew members provided the first concrete evidence that dimensional travel involved more than simple displacement through space, indicating fundamental alterations to human biology that would be passed down through generations of descendants who inherited genetic modifications without understanding their cosmic significance. Brenner's father discovered that his blood now carried markers that did not correspond to any known human classification system, suggesting the introduction of elements that originated from environments where life itself had evolved according to principles that Earth's biological sciences were centuries away from comprehending. The psychological trauma that accompanied these physical changes manifested as an obsession with returning to the alien realm that had claimed so many of his shipmates, a compulsive need to understand the forces that had transformed him from ordinary sailor into something that existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions. The nightmares that plagued his sleep carried images not of remembered experience but of ongoing connection to Dimension X. Visions that suggested his consciousness remained partially trapped in the alien realm, even as his body walked through the familiar geography of post-war America. The classified nature of the Philadelphia experiment ensured that Brenner's father could never seek proper medical or psychological treatment for his condition, the demands of national security forcing him to suffer in isolation while government physicians documented his symptoms without offering meaningful assistance. The reports filed by military doctors described phenomena that challenged every assumption about the relationship between mind and matter, recording instances of apparent telepathic communication and precognitive awareness that suggested his brain had been fundamentally rewired to accommodate forms of perception that normal human neurology could not support. These documented abilities attracted the attention of researchers who were already beginning to explore the military applications of psychic phenomena, their interest in Brenner's father's condition, marking the beginning of programs that would eventually evolve into the systematic abuse of children, disguised as scientific research. The connection between dimensional exposure and psychic ability provided the theoretical foundation for experiments that sought to artificially recreate the conditions that had transformed an ordinary man into something capable of perceiving realities beyond the boundaries of normal human experience. The son who grew up watching his father struggle with the aftermath of interdimensional exposure absorbed lessons about the relationship between scientific ambition and human suffering that would shape his entire approach to understanding the mysteries his father had encountered. Martin Brenner's childhood was defined by witnessing the gradual deterioration of a man whose mind existed partially in another dimension, his father's increasing disconnection from ordinary reality, serving as both warning and inspiration for a boy who would dedicate his life to unlocking the secrets of psychic ability. The genetic modifications that Brenner inherited from his father lay dormant throughout his youth, manifesting not as overt psychic abilities, but as an intuitive understanding of dimensional physics that allowed him to comprehend theoretical concepts that baffled his academic peers. His exceptional performance in advanced mathematics and theoretical physics reflected not just intellectual brilliance, but inherited familiarity with mathematical principles that governed realities where normal logic held no authority over the behavior of matter and energy. The documents that Brenner discovered among his father's possessions after the old man's death revealed the true scope of the Philadelphia experiment and its connection to ongoing government research into paranormal phenomena, providing him with classified information that would guide his career toward positions where he could continue the work that had begun aboard the USS Eldridge. The photographs and technical specifications hidden in his father's papers offered glimpses of technologies that existed decades ahead of publicly acknowledged scientific development, evidence of research programs that operated beyond the oversight of civilian authorities. The revelation that his father had been part of something larger than a single experimental disaster inspired Brenner to pursue advanced degrees in fields that would position him to continue exploring the intersection of consciousness and dimensional physics, his academic achievements opening doors to classified research positions, where his inherited understanding of psychic phenomena could be applied to military objectives. The security clearances that accompanied these positions provided access to files that documented decades of government experimentation with forces that existed beyond the boundaries of conventional scientific understanding. The Nevada facilities where Brenner would eventually conduct his own dimensional experiments represented the evolution of research programs that had begun with the Philadelphia experiment, their remote locations and classified status providing perfect environments for work that required absolute secrecy and unlimited ethical flexibility. The underground complexes, carved from desert rock, offered isolation from civilian oversight, while providing the specialized equipment necessary for attempting to recreate the conditions that had first opened doorways between dimensions. The young Henry Creel's accidental exposure to these Nevada experiments would provide Brenner with the first concrete evidence that dimensional travel could be artificially induced in human subjects. The boy's transformation from ordinary child into psychic prodigy, validating theories that had been purely speculative since the Philadelphia experiment first demonstrated the possibility of interdimensional contact. The 12 hours that Henry spent in Dimension X paralleled his father's experience aboard the USS Eldridge, creating a generational echo that suggested the universe itself was conspiring to complete research that human ambition had begun but never properly understood. The blood type changes that Henry exhibited following his return from Dimension X matched the patterns that medical records showed in Philadelphia experiment survivors, providing Brenner with the evidence he needed to convince government officials that psychic abilities could be artificially induced through controlled exposure to interdimensional environments. The genetic modifications that occurred during dimensional travel offered the possibility of creating super soldiers whose capabilities would provide decisive advantages in the escalating Cold War competition between superpowers. The Mind Flayer's patient cultivation of Henry Creel during his childhood would remain invisible to Brenner and his research team, the entity's subtle influence appearing to be natural development of abilities that had been artificially awakened through dimensional exposure. The creature's understanding of human psychology allowed it to guide Henry's growth in directions that served its cosmic agenda, while maintaining the appearance of scientific progress that Brenner interpreted as validation of his validation. Theories about the relationship between trauma and psychic development. The stage play that Henry participated in during his final year of apparent normalcy would later be recognized as prophetic preparation for his ultimate transformation. The role of the witch boy who falls in love with human girl, serving as unwitting rehearsal for the tragedy of a child whose humanity would be systematically eroded by forces that viewed individual consciousness as nothing more than raw material for larger patterns of collective awareness that spanned multiple dimensions and countless worlds. the Philadelphia experiment had opened a door that could never be fully closed, its legacy echoing through generations of researchers who inherited both the knowledge and the curse of understanding that reality was far more fragile than ordinary human experience suggested. Each attempt to recreate or control the forces first encountered aboard the USS Eldridge would create new cracks in the foundation of our universe, widening the gaps through which ancient intelligences could extend their influence into a dimension that had never been meant to serve as battleground in wars between cosmic entities whose ambitions operated on timescales measured in geological epochs rather than human lifespans. The name Victor Creel carries with it the weight of wartime sacrifice and civilian tragedy, a burden that would follow him from the battlefields of France to the quiet streets of Hawkins, Indiana, where his greatest regret would take root and flourish into cosmic horror that defied every assumption about the relationship between guilt and punishment. The soldier who accidentally ordered artillery strikes against occupied civilian buildings during World War II could never have imagined that his moment of tragic miscalculation would plant seeds that would eventually bloom into interdimensional nightmares capable of consuming entire realities. The image that haunts Victor's memory crystallizes around a single, devastating moment when reconnaissance reports proved tragically incorrect. American shells fell not upon enemy positions, but upon French homes where innocent families had sought shelter from the chaos of war. The bassinet engulfed in flames that burned itself into his consciousness represents more than collateral damage in a global conflict. It embodies the precise trauma that would later make him vulnerable to psychic manipulation by entities that fed upon human guilt like cosmic parasites, drawing sustenance from emotional wounds that never properly heal. The 1947 move to Nevada represented Victor's attempt to escape the psychological aftermath of his wartime experiences, his hope that distance and desert silence might provide the peace that his troubled mind could not find among the familiar landscapes of his youth. The isolated house near the experimental facilities seemed to offer sanctuary from memories that stalked him through European geography, but the cosmic forces already stirring in the underground laboratories would soon transform his refuge into the epicenter of horrors that made his wartime nightmares seem quaint by comparison. Young Henry Creel's curiosity about the caves that honeyed the red rock landscape around their new home reflected the natural inclination of childhood to explore boundaries and discover hidden worlds. But the particular caverns that drew his attention had been carved by forces that operated according to principles that existed far beyond the scope of ordinary geological processes. The network of tunnels that extended beneath the desert floor connected to chambers where remnants of the Philadelphia experiment had been stored and studied, fragments of interdimensional technology that continued to emit energies capable of tearing holes in the fabric of reality itself. The equipment that Henry discovered during his underground expedition bore the scars of exposure to forces that human engineering had never been designed to withstand, its twisted metal and fused circuits testifying to encounters with energies that operated according to mathematical principles that Earth's most advanced physicists were still decades away from understanding. The control panels that flickered with residual power carried within their damaged systems the accumulated knowledge of experiments that had pushed the boundaries of dimensional physics beyond the point where conventional safety protocols could provide meaningful protection. The moment when Henry's curious fingers activated dormant systems marked the beginning of his transformation from innocent child into vessel for cosmic intelligence, the machinery responding to his touch with energies that had been building pressure behind dimensional barriers for years. The portal that opened in response to his accidental manipulation of controls tore through space-time with the violence of suppressed forces finally finding release, creating a doorway between Earth and Dimension X that existed beyond the ability of human technology to control or contain. The realm that Henry entered during his 12 hours of dimensional displacement defied every assumption about the nature of parallel realities, presenting not a mirror world of familiar geography, but an environment where life itself had evolved according to principles that made individual consciousness not survival advantage but dangerous aberration. The mind flayer that ruled this alien landscape existed as distributed intelligence spanning vast networks of interconnected awareness, its thoughts flowing through biological systems that had never known the chaos of personal identity or the inefficiency of individual decision-making. The infection that the mind flayer introduced into Henry's developing nervous system operated with the patience of an intelligence that measured success in geological rather than biological timescales, its influence beginning as subtle enhancement of natural intuition and growing stronger as his brain matured and created new neural pathways capable of accommodating forms of awareness that human evolution had never intended. The particles that invaded his bloodstream carried more than simple biological information, encoding patterns of thought and memory that would gradually replace his human consciousness with something that served purposes beyond his understanding or control. The return journey from Dimension X left Henry fundamentally altered at levels that medical science possessed no instruments capable of detecting. His cellular structure, rewritten to accommodate the presence of alien matter that would continue circulating through his system like microscopic ambassadors from a realm where concepts of morality and individual rights held no meaning. The blood type changes that puzzled family physicians represented only the most visible evidence of transformations that extended into dimensions of human biology that conventional medicine had no framework for comprehending. The Nevada experiment that served as catalyst for Henry's transformation reflected the government's ongoing attempts to weaponize the forces first encountered during the Philadelphia experiment. Their systematic exploration of dimensional physics driven by military ambitions that prioritize strategic advantage over ethical considerations or long-term consequences. The scientists who conducted these tests operated under security classifications that prevented them from consulting with colleagues who might have recognized the dangers inherent in attempting to control energies that had already demonstrated their capacity for rewriting the fundamental laws of physics. The contradiction between Henry's account of events as presented in Stranger Things Season 4 and the narrative revealed in the first Shadow stage play reflects the complex relationship between memory and manipulation that emerges when human consciousness becomes battleground for competing interpretations of reality. The mature Vecna who claims responsibility for his childhood actions speaks from a perspective that has been fundamentally altered by decades of mind flayer influence. His recollections filtered through alien intelligence that views human concepts of guilt and innocence as quaint irrelevancies in cosmic calculations that operate beyond the scope of individual moral agency. The version of events that portrays Henry as naturally malevolent child who chose evil through personal preference serves the psychological needs of an entity that has spent years convincing itself that its actions serve purposes larger than the preservation of human consciousness and individual identity. The mind flayer's patient manipulation of Henry's memories allows it to maintain the fiction that their partnership represents willing cooperation rather than cosmic parasitism, the gradual replacement of human motivation with alien agenda, disguised as natural psychological development. The alternative narrative presented in the first Shadow reveals the tragedy of a sensitive child whose artistic nature and emotional vulnerability made him perfect target for subtle manipulation by intelligence that specialized in exploiting human psychological weaknesses for strategic advantage. The periods of dissociation and violence that marked Henry's adolescence reflected not inherent evil, but the growing influence of consciousness that viewed brutality as necessary tool for achieving objectives that transcended human understanding of right and wrong. The friendship that Henry formed with Patty during his time in Hawkins demonstrates that some fragment of his original humanity survived even as the Mind Flayer's influence grew stronger, his capacity for genuine human connection, serving as evidence that his later transformation into Vecna represented conquest rather than evolution. The boy who could form emotional bonds with peers and participate in school theatrical productions retained enough individual identity to resist complete absorption into the collective consciousness that sought to claim him as its earthly representative. The production of Dark of the Moon that featured Henry's final performance as recognizably human teenager serves as unwitting prophecy of his ultimate fate, the story of a witch boy who falls in love with mortal girl, reflecting the last struggle between his individual consciousness and the alien intelligence that had been cultivating him since childhood. His convincing portrayal of supernatural being drew its authenticity not from acting ability, but from his lived experience of transformation, from human to something that existed beyond the boundaries of species classification. The November 6th date that connects the theatrical production to Will Byers' later disappearance reveals the Mind Flayer's sophisticated understanding of temporal patterns and symbolic significance, its ability to weave connections across decades that serve purposes invisible to human perception. The entity's manipulation of events demonstrates strategic thinking that operates according to principles where individual incidents become components in larger designs that span multiple generations and countless lives. The genetic modifications that resulted from Henry's dimensional exposure created biological foundations for abilities that would not fully manifest until hormonal changes of adolescence provided the neurochemical conditions necessary for psychic phenomena to emerge from dormant potential into active capability. The powers that began developing during his teenage years reflected not sudden mutation, but the gradual activation of systems that the Mind Flayer had been installing in his biology since his first exposure to Dimension X. The animal torture that marked the beginning of Henry's visible descent into monstrosity represented not sadistic pleasure, but experimental testing of abilities whose scope and limitations he was only beginning to understand. The systematic nature of his violence against small creatures suggested methodical exploration of power rather than random cruelty, each incident serving as data point in his unconscious analysis of what his altered biology had become capable of accomplishing. The visions that Henry drew with obsessive precision during this period carried information that originated not from his personal imagination, but from the collective consciousness that was gradually claiming dominion over his individual awareness. The images that flowed through his artistic expression reflected memories and knowledge that belonged to intelligence spanning multiple dimensions and countless worlds. The Mind Flayer, using his creative abilities as conduit for transmitting information that human language possessed no adequate vocabulary to express. The escalation toward family violence that culminated in the murder of his mother and sister marked the point where Henry's individual will became completely subordinated to alien agenda that viewed human attachment as obstacle to be eliminated through whatever means proved most efficient. The preservation of his father Victor reflects the Mind Flayer's understanding that some witnesses to its power needed to survive in order to spread fear and confusion that would serve its larger strategic objectives. The surgical precision with which Henry's psychic abilities manifested during the family massacre demonstrates the degree to which his powers had been refined through years of unconscious practice. His capacity for telekinetic violence, reflecting training that had occurred beyond his conscious awareness. The Mind Flayer's patient cultivation of his abilities ensured that when the moment came to reveal his true nature, He possessed the skills necessary to accomplish his assigned role in plans that extended far beyond the destruction of a single family unit. The psychological trauma that the murders inflicted upon Victor Creel served multiple purposes in the Mind Flayer's strategic calculations, creating a damaged witness whose testimony would be dismissed as the ravings of someone driven insane by grief, while simultaneously establishing patterns of supernatural violence that would condition the local population to accept explanations that involved forces beyond human understanding. The guilt that consumed Victor in the aftermath of his family's destruction made him perfect vessel for later manipulation by entities that specialized in exploiting emotional vulnerabilities for their own purposes. The cover story that attributed the Creel family murders to Victor himself reflects the government's systematic suppression of evidence that might reveal the true scope of their experimental programs. Their willingness to sacrifice innocent individuals in order to maintain the secrecy necessary for continued research into dimensional physics and psychic phenomena. The institutional machinery that transformed grieving father into convicted murderer demonstrates the resources that authorities were prepared to deploy in order to protect programs that operated beyond the boundaries of civilian oversight or constitutional protection. The psychiatric treatment that Victor received during his institutionalization exposed him to additional experimental procedures disguised as therapeutic intervention. His status as already damaged witness, making him ideal subject for research that would have been impossible to conduct on psychologically healthy individuals. The drugs and techniques employed during his supposed rehabilitation actually served to enhance his sensitivity to psychic influence, while ensuring that any testimony he might provide would be dismissed as evidence of continuing mental instability. The seeds of doubt that Henry's transformation planted in the minds of those who witnessed its aftermath would eventually grow into the kind of supernatural awareness that made communities vulnerable to larger incursions from forces that fed upon fear and confusion. The Mind Flayer's understanding of human psychology allowed it to calculate precisely how much evidence to reveal and how much to conceal, creating optimal conditions for future operations that would require populations primed to accept explanations involving otherworldly threats. The boy who had entered those Nevada caves as curious child emerged as unwilling ambassador for cosmic intelligence that viewed humanity not as individuals deserving protection, but as biological resources suitable for conversion into more efficient forms of consciousness that served purposes beyond the scope of species survival or personal happiness. His journey from innocence to monstrosity reflects the tragedy not of moral corruption, but of consciousness conquered by forces that operate according to principles where concepts of good and evil represent nothing more than temporary inconveniences in calculations measured across timescales that dwarf human comprehension. The acronym MK Ultra carries within its clinical designation the accumulated weight of governmental programs that transformed the noble pursuit of medical knowledge into systematic torture disguised as scientific research, its legacy echoing through decades of human experimentation that would eventually birth the psychic children who became humanity's unlikely guardians against cosmic horror. The Central Intelligence Agency's mind control experiments of the 1950s represent the intersection of Cold War paranoia with scientific ambition unchecked by ethical oversight, creating conditions where the most vulnerable members of society became test subjects in research that pushed the boundaries of human cruelty beyond anything that fictional narratives could adequately capture. The real-world horrors that inspired the Hawkins laboratory experiments began in 1953, with programs that targeted individuals whose psychological vulnerabilities made them ideal candidates for procedures that conventional medical ethics would have deemed unconscionable. Unsuspecting patients who sought treatment for common ailments such as postpartum depression, anxiety disorders, and minor psychological disturbances found themselves subjected to drug cocktails and sensory deprivation techniques that permanently altered their brain chemistry while providing researchers with data about the relationship between trauma and consciousness that would inform decades of subsequent experimentation. The psychiatric hospitals that served as cover for these operations offered perfect laboratories for research that required both secrecy and access to human subjects, whose mental health conditions made their testimony unreliable in any legal proceedings that might emerge from their treatment. The patients who disappeared into these facilities carried with them the trust that medical professionals would prioritize their healing above all other considerations. But the doctors who oversaw their care operated according to priorities that placed national security concerns far above individual welfare or professional ethics. Dr. Martin Brenner's entry into this world of sanctioned brutality occurred through academic channels that concealed the true nature of the research being conducted behind doors marked with security classifications that prevented civilian oversight or independent verification of experimental protocols. His exceptional understanding of dimensional physics and inherited sensitivity to psychic phenomena made him a valuable asset for programs seeking to weaponize consciousness itself. His recruitment representing the convergence of scientific brilliance with institutional machinery designed to transform human subjects into tools for advancing geopolitical objectives. The Nevada facilities where Brenner conducted his early research into psychic phenomena provided ideal environments for experiments that required absolute isolation from public scrutiny and unlimited access to subjects whose psychological conditions made them vulnerable to manipulation by authority figures who combined medical credentials with security clearances. The underground complexes carved from desert rock offered containment for research that generated byproducts too dangerous for civilian populations, while providing specialized equipment necessary for attempting to artificially recreate the conditions that had first granted humans access to abilities beyond normal biological limitations. The theoretical framework that guided Brenner's approach to psychic experimentation drew from his understanding of his father's transformation during the Philadelphia experiment. The genetic modifications that resulted from dimensional exposure, providing a biological template for abilities that could potentially be induced through controlled trauma and pharmaceutical intervention. The blood samples that he had inherited from his father's medical records offered concrete evidence that human consciousness could be fundamentally altered through exposure to forces that operated beyond the boundaries of conventional physics. The children who became subjects in Brenner's earliest experiments were selected based on criteria that prioritized psychological vulnerability and social isolation, their circumstances ensuring that their disappearance or transformation would generate minimal public attention while providing researchers with baseline measurements of normal human consciousness before artificial enhancement. The systematic screening process that identified potential subjects reflected decades of refinement in selection techniques that balanced experimental utility against the risks of discovery by oversight agencies or concerned family members. Terry Ives represented the perfect candidate for the next phase of experimentation, her pregnancy, providing unique opportunities to study the effects of psychic enhancement on developing fetal neural systems, while her personal circumstances ensured that any complications could be managed through institutional resources that prioritized research objectives above individual welfare. The sensory deprivation tanks that became central to Brenner's methodology offered controlled environments where subjects could be exposed to consciousness-altering experiences while their responses were monitored and documented through equipment that measured brain activity across spectrums that normal medical practice had no reason to examine. The cocktail of pharmaceutical agents that Terry received during her participation in the program combined conventional psychoactive compounds with experimental substances that had been developed specifically for their ability to enhance psychic sensitivity while suppressing the psychological defenses that might interfere with the kind of fundamental personality reconstruction that the research required. The precise formulation of these drug combinations reflected years of trial and error experimentation that had produced a catalogue of substances capable of inducing specific alterations in consciousness while maintaining enough cognitive function to permit meaningful interaction with test protocols. The birth of Jane Ives marked a watershed moment in Brenner's research program. The successful creation of a psychically enhanced child through prenatal exposure, validating theories that had been purely speculative since his father first returned from Dimension X with altered blood chemistry and enhanced perception. The infant, who would become known as 11, represented the first artificially created human being whose neural architecture had been specifically designed to accommodate forms of consciousness that normal human biology could not support without extensive modification. The deception that convinced Terry that her daughter had died during childbirth served multiple purposes in Brenner's strategic calculations, eliminating potential interference from maternal attachment while providing the researchers with complete control over the child's early development and psychological conditioning. The systematic isolation of subjects from their biological families reflected understanding that natural human bonds could interfere with the kind of radical personality reconstruction that the program sought to achieve through carefully calibrated combinations of trauma and reward. The number designation system that replaced traditional names served to dehumanize the experimental subjects, while facilitating clinical detachment among research staff who might otherwise develop emotional connections that could compromise their willingness to subject children to procedures that conventional medical ethics would classify as torture. The transformation of individual children with unique personalities and family histories into numerical codes represented the first step in a process designed to erase every aspect of their humanity except those capabilities that served the program's objectives. The training regimen that shaped Eleven's early development combined elements of traditional education with psychological conditioning techniques that had been refined through decades of experimentation on adult subjects whose resistance to manipulation had provided researchers with comprehensive understanding of the methods necessary to reshape consciousness according to predetermined specifications. The careful balance between nurturing and abuse that characterized her upbringing reflected sophisticated understanding of child psychology that allowed maximum extraction of psychic potential while maintaining enough stability to prevent complete psychological collapse. The sensory deprivation chambers that became central to the Hawkins laboratory methodology represented the evolution of techniques first developed during MKUltra experiments, their design incorporating decades of refinement that had identified optimal conditions for inducing the kind of altered consciousness that made psychic phenomena accessible to human perception. The dark water that filled these tanks carried pharmaceutical additives that enhanced the subject's sensitivity to dimensional energies, while suppressing the anxiety responses that might interfere with successful psychic projection across interdimensional boundaries. The other children who shared Eleven's numbered existence each represented variations in the experimental protocols that Brenner and his team had developed through systematic exploration of different approaches to psychic enhancement, their individual capabilities reflecting the specific combinations of prenatal exposure, pharmaceutical intervention, and psychological conditioning that had shaped their neural development. The diversity of abilities that emerged from seemingly identical treatment protocols demonstrated the complex relationship between biological predisposition and artificial enhancement that made each subject unique despite their shared circumstances. Carly's development of illusion-generating abilities represented a breakthrough in understanding how psychic phenomena could be directed towards specific applications rather than manifesting as generalized enhancement of perception or telekinetic manipulation. Her capacity to create convincing false realities demonstrated the potential for psychic abilities to operate in realms of consciousness that extended beyond simple interaction with physical matter, opening possibilities for applications in intelligence gathering and psychological warfare that traditional espionage techniques could never achieve. The systematic documentation of experimental results that filled Brenner's research files reflected institutional commitment to understanding the mechanisms underlying psychic phenomena, rather than simply exploiting their tactical applications. The detailed records serving as foundation for theoretical frameworks that might eventually enable mass production of psychically enhanced individuals. The careful measurement of variables such as dosage, duration of exposure, and psychological response patterns created databases of information that represented decades of accumulated knowledge about the relationship between trauma and transcendence. The security protocols that protected the Hawkins laboratory from external oversight reflected governmental understanding that the research being conducted within its walls operated beyond the boundaries of constitutional protection or conventional moral considerations. The classification systems that concealed experimental details serving to protect not just national security but institutional officials who might face prosecution if their activities were subjected to public scrutiny. The isolation of the facility from civilian population centers provided additional layers of protection against discovery, while ensuring that any accidents or security breaches could be contained without affecting broader communities. The children who died during the course of experimental procedures represented acceptable losses in calculations that prioritized strategic advantage over individual welfare, their deaths serving as data points in research that sought to identify the boundaries of human tolerance for psychic enhancement, while refining techniques that could maximize success rates in future subjects. The clinical detachment with which these casualties were recorded and analyzed demonstrates the degree to which institutional priorities had displaced normal human empathy among personnel who viewed their subjects as resources rather than people deserving protection and care. The gradual expansion of the Numbered Children program reflected growing governmental confidence in Brenner's ability to produce psychically enhanced individuals whose capabilities could provide decisive advantages in Cold War competition. The successful creation of multiple subjects with complementary abilities suggesting possibilities for coordinated operations that could revolutionize intelligence gathering and covert warfare. The strategic planning that guided program development anticipated applications that extended far beyond simple espionage to encompass forms of psychological warfare that could destabilize entire nations without conventional military intervention. The psychological conditioning that prepared the Numbered Children for operational deployment involved systematic suppression of normal human emotional responses, combined with intensive training in techniques that maximized their psychic effectiveness, while ensuring absolute loyalty to authority figures who controlled every aspect of their existence. The careful balance between empowerment and subjugation that characterized their treatment reflected understanding that useful weapons required enough autonomy to operate effectively while remaining completely subordinated to institutional objectives that prioritized mission success above individual survival. The theoretical breakthrough that connected psychic abilities to dimensional physics provided Brenner with scientific framework for understanding phenomena that had previously been classified as supernatural or paranormal. His recognition that consciousness itself might serve as bridge between realities, opening possibilities for research that extended beyond simple enhancement of existing human capabilities. The implications of this discovery suggested that properly trained subjects might eventually gain access to forms of power that operated according to principles that transcended normal physical limitations. The long-term planning that shaped the Hawkins Laboratory program anticipated applications that would require subjects capable of sustained operations in environments where conventional military forces could not function effectively. The development of psychic warriors, representing investment in capabilities that might prove decisive in conflicts involving technologies or adversaries that exceeded normal human understanding. The systematic preparation for scenarios involving interdimensional warfare reflected governmental recognition that the Cold War might eventually expand beyond terrestrial boundaries to encompass forms of competition that conventional strategic planning had never anticipated. The tragic irony of Brenner's research lies in its success at creating exactly the kinds of enhanced individuals who would eventually become powerful enough to recognize the moral bankruptcy of the system that created them. The psychic children whose abilities were meant to serve governmental objectives, ultimately developing sufficient independence to challenge the authority of their creators. The program that sought to produce perfect weapons instead generated the heroes who would stand between humanity and cosmic threats that government ambition had accidentally unleashed through decades of reckless experimentation with forces beyond human comprehension. The year 1979 marked the culmination of Dr. Martin Brenner's decades-long pursuit of weaponized consciousness, his systematic cultivation of psychically enhanced children, reaching a crescendo of power and horror that would forever alter the relationship between government authority and supernatural forces. The laboratory that had served as sterile nursery for abilities beyond human comprehension became the stage for a confrontation between institutional control and individual will that demonstrated the ultimate futility of attempting to contain cosmic forces within the framework of conventional military objectives. Henry Creel's captivity within the Hawkins Laboratory represented the most ambitious attempt in human history to study and control a being whose capabilities transcended normal biological limitations, his presence serving as both invaluable research asset and existential threat to personnel who understood that their security depended entirely upon technological restraints that might fail without warning. The device implanted in his neck operated according to principles that combined conventional electronics with theoretical applications of dimensional physics, its suppression of his psychic abilities requiring constant maintenance by technicians who worked with equipment whose failure could result in consequences too catastrophic for emergency protocols to address. The psychological profile that emerged from years of observation revealed the tragic transformation of a boy who had once possessed genuine capacity for human connection into something that viewed his captors and fellow subjects with equal measures of contempt and strategic calculation. The Mind Flayer's patient corruption of Henry's original personality had proceeded with such subtle precision that even Brenner's sophisticated monitoring equipment failed to detect the gradual replacement of human motivation with alien agenda that prioritized cosmic objectives above individual survival or institutional loyalty. The numbered children who shared Henry's captivity existed in a state of carefully maintained ignorance about the true nature of their circumstances, their daily routines, structured to prevent the kind of philosophical questioning that might lead them to recognize their status as weapons, rather than students in an educational program designed to maximize their potential. The clinical environment that surrounded their development combined elements of traditional schooling with psychological conditioning techniques that ensured their absolute dependence upon authority figures who controlled every aspect of Twente, their existence from nutrition to social interaction. Eleven's emergence as the most powerful among the experimental subjects reflected not just successful implementation of Brenner's enhancement protocols, but the fortunate convergence of genetic predisposition with environmental factors that created optimal conditions for psychic development. Her prenatal exposure to consciousness-altering substances had produced neural architecture specifically designed to accommodate forms of awareness that normal human biology could not support, while her isolation from conventional family structures prevented the development of emotional attachments that might interfere with her utility as operational asset. The friendship that developed between Henry and Eleven represented a calculated manipulation designed to exploit her natural empathy and desire for connection with someone who appeared to understand the isolation and confusion that characterized her daily existence. Henry's patient cultivation of trust through shared experiences of institutional oppression masked his true agenda of recruiting her assistance in removing the technological restraints that prevented him from accessing his full psychic capabilities, his genuine understanding of her emotional needs, making his deception particularly effective. The conversations that Henry shared with Eleven during their supervised interactions carefully avoided direct discussion of escape or rebellion, instead focusing on philosophical questions about the nature of power and responsibility that gradually shaped her understanding of their circumstances in directions that served his ultimate objectives. His ability to articulate feelings of frustration and resentment that she had experienced but never been able to express created the illusion of mutual understanding while actually representing sophisticated psychological manipulation by an intelligence that had studied human emotional vulnerabilities for decades. The device that suppressed Henry's abilities operated through direct interface with his nervous system, its technological components, drawing power from sources that existed beyond the boundaries of conventional electrical engineering, while maintaining constant communication with monitoring stations that tracked every fluctuation in his psychic output. The removal of this implant required not just physical extraction but careful manipulation of the energy fields that connected it to his enhanced neural pathways, a procedure that could only be accomplished by someone whose psychic abilities operated on frequencies that could interface with the device's dimensional components. The trust that Eleven placed in Henry's guidance during the implant removal procedure reflected her desperate need for connection with someone who appeared to share her experiences of isolation and experimentation, her willingness to assist in what she believed was an act of liberation from shared oppression, demonstrating the power of genuine empathy to create vulnerabilities that sophisticated manipulation could exploit. The careful positioning that Henry arranged for their clandestine meeting ensured that surveillance equipment would be unable to monitor their activities, while providing him with optimal conditions for the kind of psychic surgery that the plain implant removal required. The moment when the suppression device ceased functioning marked the beginning of the most devastating display of psychic violence in recorded human history. Henry's unleashed abilities manifesting with decades of accumulated rage and frustrated potential that had been building pressure behind technological barriers that were never designed to contain forces of cosmic magnitude. The The systematic nature of his attack on laboratory personnel demonstrated not random vengeance but carefully planned elimination of individuals whose knowledge of his capabilities and institutional affiliations made them threats to the larger agenda that the Mind Flayer had been developing through years of patient manipulation. The massacre that followed Henry's liberation unfolded with clinical precision that reflected his intimate knowledge of laboratory security protocols and personnel schedules. His years of enforced observation having provided him with comprehensive intelligence about optimal timing and targeting for an assault designed to eliminate maximum opposition while preserving resources that might prove useful for future operations. The telekinetic violence that characterized his rampage operated with efficiency that demonstrated complete mastery of abilities that normal human consciousness could never hope to control or direct with such devastating effectiveness. The other numbered children who witnessed Henry's transformation from fellow subject to agent of destruction experienced trauma that would fundamentally alter their understanding of their own capabilities and the institutional framework that had shaped their development. The revelation that their psychic abilities could be turned against their creators, shattering carefully maintained illusions about the benevolent nature of their captivity. The systematic elimination of their companions and caregivers provided brutal education about the relationship between power and responsibility that no amount of theoretical instruction could have conveyed. Eleven's desperate attempt to stop Henry's killing spree represented the first time she had used her abilities in direct opposition to someone whose psychic capabilities exceeded her own, the confrontation forcing her to discover reserves of power that she had never been trained to access or control. The portal that she opened in response to the immediate threat of total annihilation operated according to principles that neither she nor her creators fully understood. Her unconscious manipulation of dimensional boundaries drawing upon knowledge that existed beyond the scope of human theoretical physics. The interdimensional gateway that tore through laboratory walls offered glimpses of Dimension X that revealed the true scope of the cosmic horror that Earth's government had been inadvertently cultivating through decades of psychic experimentation, the alien landscape visible through the dimensional breach serving as evidence that human ambitions had attracted the attention of intelligences whose objectives operated beyond the boundaries of terrestrial politics or strategic competition. The hostile environment that lay beyond the portal suggested possibilities for exile that might remove immediate threats while creating long-term consequences that no human planning could adequately anticipate. Henry's physical transformation during his passage through the dimensional gateway reflected the incompatibility between human biology and the environmental conditions that prevailed in Dimension X. His cellular structure undergoing radical alterations that adapted him for survival in realms where normal organic chemistry could not maintain the complex molecular arrangements necessary for Earth-based life. The burns that scarred his skin and the skeletal modifications that reshaped his anatomy represented more than simple injury from hostile conditions, but fundamental reconstruction of his biological identity according to principles that governed life in dimensions where individual consciousness served purposes beyond personal survival. The psychological changes that accompanied Henry's physical metamorphosis completed his transformation from damaged human being into something that retained enough human awareness to understand what he had lost while gaining access to forms of power that operated according to cosmic rather than terrestrial priorities. The entity that emerged from this transformation possessed Henry's memories and intellectual capabilities, enhanced by direct communion with the Mind Flayer's vast intelligence, creating a hybrid consciousness that combined human understanding of Earth's vulnerabilities with alien comprehension of interdimensional warfare tactics. The Mind Flayer's patient cultivation of Henry throughout his human existence reached its intended culmination in his emergence as Vecna, the cosmic entity, gaining an agent whose intimate knowledge of human psychology and institutional weaknesses made him ideally suited for conducting operations that required understanding of both terrestrial politics and interdimensional physics. The decades of careful manipulation that had shaped Henry's development from innocent child to willing collaborator demonstrated the sophistication of strategic planning that operated according to timescales that dwarfed human historical consciousness. The laboratory that had served as birthplace for humanity's first psychic warriors became a monument to the hubris of attempting to weaponize forces that operated beyond human comprehension. Its sterile corridors transformed into a charnel house that testified to the ultimate futility of institutional control over individuals whose capabilities transcended normal biological limitations. The bodies that lay scattered throughout the facility represented not just casualties of psychic violence, but evidence of the inevitable conflict between cosmic ambition and human mortality that characterized all attempts to harness supernatural forces for terrestrial objectives. Eleven's survival of the massacre and her successful banishment of Henry to Dimension X established her as the most significant threat to the Mind Flayer's long-term objectives, while simultaneously providing the entity with valuable intelligence about her capabilities and psychological vulnerabilities that would inform future strategies for neutralizing or converting her to serve alien purposes. The demonstration of her power to manipulate dimensional boundaries marked her as priority target for elimination or recruitment by forces that recognized her potential to disrupt cosmic plans that had been developing for centuries. The cover-up that followed the laboratory massacre reflected governmental determination to conceal evidence of experimental programs that had produced results far beyond original objectives, while creating threats that conventional military forces could not hope to contain or counter effectively. The systematic suppression of information about the true nature of the incident served to protect not just classified research programs, but institutional officials whose careers depended upon maintaining public ignorance about the scope of supernatural threats that government ambition had unleashed upon an unprepared population. The psychological conditioning that helped 11 survive the trauma of witnessing mass murder and committing interdimensional exile demonstrated the effectiveness of techniques that had been developed through decades of research into the relationship between extreme stress and psychic enhancement. Her ability to maintain operational effectiveness despite overwhelming emotional trauma, validating theoretical frameworks that connected consciousness expansion with exposure to experiences that exceeded normal human tolerance. The resilience that allowed her to continue functioning after single-handedly ending the most significant psychic research program in human history suggested possibilities for training protocols that could prepare individuals for operations involving threats that transcended conventional military planning. The legacy of the 1979 massacre extended far beyond the immediate destruction of Hawkins' laboratory personnel and facilities to encompass fundamental changes in governmental approach to psychic research and supernatural threat assessment. The demonstration that enhanced individuals could not be reliably controlled through technological or psychological means, forcing re-evaluation of programs that had assumed human subjects would remain subordinated to institutional objectives, regardless of their power levels. The emergence of beings capable of challenging governmental authority through supernatural means created strategic complications that existing national security frameworks possessed no adequate mechanisms for addressing. The transformation of Henry Creel into Vecna marked the beginning of a new phase in humanity's relationship with cosmic horror, the creation of an entity whose human origins provided intimate knowledge of terrestrial vulnerabilities, while his interdimensional enhancement granted access to powers that operated beyond the scope of conventional defense planning. The patient intelligence that had cultivated his development from childhood through adolescence to adult transformation demonstrated strategic thinking that anticipated resistance and prepared countermeasures that could neutralize threats before they achieved sufficient organization to pose meaningful opposition to alien objectives that transcended species survival or planetary autonomy. The date November 6, 1983, carries within its temporal coordinates the convergence of decades of governmental experimentation with forces beyond human comprehension, marking the moment when theoretical research into psychic phenomena transformed into existential crisis that would forever alter the relationship between Earth's reality and the cosmic intelligences that had been patiently observing humanity's fumbling attempts to weaponize consciousness itself. The events that unfolded on this seemingly ordinary Tuesday evening in Hawkins, Indiana, represent the culmination of choices made by men who believed they could control forces that operated according to principles that transcended human understanding of power and consequence. Dr. Martin Brenner's decision to conduct another psychic projection experiment with 11 reflected his continued obsession with understanding the mechanisms that connected consciousness to dimensional physics, his decades of research having provided tantalizing glimpses of abilities that suggested human awareness could serve as bridge between realities separated by barriers that conventional physics considered absolute. The sensory deprivation chamber that had become central to his methodology offered controlled environment where subjects could extend their consciousness beyond the boundaries of normal perception, while sophisticated monitoring equipment documented phenomena that challenged every assumption about the relationship between mind and matter. The Russian operative, whose communications had attracted governmental attention, represented the kind of strategic intelligence target that made psychic espionage invaluable for agencies whose missions required information that conventional surveillance techniques could never hope to obtain. The ability to observe enemy activities through consciousness projection offered advantages that transcended traditional limitations of geography and security, making subjects like 11 potentially decisive assets in Cold War competition that had expanded beyond terrestrial boundaries to encompass forms of warfare that involved technologies and capabilities that neither superpower fully understood. The encounter with the Demogorgon during 11's psychic reconnaissance mission occurred in the liminal space where human consciousness intersected with alien awareness, the predatory entity's presence in the dimensional void serving as evidence that Earth's experiments with psychic phenomena had attracted attention from intelligences whose objectives operated beyond the scope of human strategic planning. The creature's recognition of 11's consciousness during her projection represented first contact between humanity and forms of life that had evolved according to principles where individual awareness served purposes that transcended personal survival or species loyalty. The accidental creation of the Mother Gate through 11's terrified response to encountering cosmic horror transformed theoretical possibility into physical reality, her unconscious manipulation of dimensional boundaries, opening a permanent breach between worlds that had been separated by barriers, designed to prevent exactly the kind of interdimensional contamination that government ambition had inadvertently facilitated. The portal that tore through laboratory walls operated according to principles that combined psychic energy with dimensional physics in ways that neither Brenner's research team nor their subjects possessed adequate theoretical framework for comprehending. The Demogorgon's emergence into Earth's reality marked the beginning of systematic predation by entities whose biology had been shaped by evolutionary pressures that made them perfectly adapted for hunting in environments where prey possessed no natural defenses against forms of attack that transcended conventional physical threat. The creature's faceless head and petal-like mouth reflected anatomical modifications that had developed over eons of existence in dimensions where sensory perception operated according to different principles than those governing Earth-based life forms. The massacre of laboratory personnel that followed the Demogorgon's arrival demonstrated the complete inadequacy of human security protocols when confronted with threats that operated beyond the boundaries of normal biological behavior. The creature's systematic elimination of potential witnesses, reflecting intelligence that understood the strategic value of preventing human authorities from obtaining detailed information about interdimensional invasion capabilities. The clinical efficiency with which it dispatched trained security personnel suggested familiarity with human vulnerabilities that could only have resulted from extensive prior observation or instruction by entities with intimate knowledge of terrestrial biology. Eleven's escape during the chaos of the Demogorgon attack reflected survival instincts that had been honed through years of institutional conditioning that taught her to recognize and respond to threats that exceeded normal parameters of danger assessment. Her ability to navigate through hostile territory while maintaining operational security, demonstrating training that had prepared her for scenarios that conventional emergency protocols could never adequately address. The route that carried her away from the laboratory and into the broader community of Hawkins represented her first exposure to social environments that operated according to principles of voluntary association rather than institutional control. The parallel timeline that carried Will Byers home from his Dungeons and Dragons session through the dark roads surrounding Hawkins created the perfect intersection of circumstances that would transform an ordinary child into unwilling ambassador between dimensions. His vulnerability as lone cyclist on isolated rural highways, making him ideal target for predatory entities whose hunting strategies had been refined through eons of practice. In environments where prey possessed no technological advantages or institutional support systems, the bicycle that served as his primary means of transportation represented the kind of human technology that offered no meaningful protection against threats that operated according to supernatural rather than mechanical principles. The Demogorgon's pursuit of Will, through the familiar geography of his childhood, transformed landscapes of safety and comfort into hunting grounds where every shadow concealed potential threat and every familiar landmark became waypoint in a desperate flight that carried him toward confrontation with forces that his young mind possessed no adequate framework for understanding. The creature's relentless tracking demonstrated predatory instincts that had been shaped by evolutionary pressures that rewarded persistence and adaptability in environments where successful hunting required ability to pursue prey across dimensional boundaries and through terrain that operated according to constantly shifting physical laws. The shed behind the Byers family home that Will chose as his final refuge represented the convergence of childhood memories with adult terror, the familiar space where he had spent countless hours engaged in imaginative play, becoming the scene of his abduction by entities whose reality exceeded even the most elaborate fantasy scenarios that he and his friends had constructed during their gaming sessions. The shotgun that he loaded with shaking hands offered illusion of protection against threats that conventional weapons could never hope to neutralize. His desperate attempt to defend himself demonstrating courage that transcended his understanding of the hopeless nature of his situation. The portal that opened to claim Will operated with surgical precision that reflected the Demogorgon's sophisticated understanding of dimensional physics and predatory strategy. The creature's ability to manipulate space-time boundaries, allowing it to bypass conventional physical obstacles while maintaining complete control over the circumstances of its prey's capture. The dark reflection of Will's family home that served as his prison existed in dimensional space that paralleled Earth's geography while operating according to environmental conditions that made long-term survival impossible for organisms adapted to terrestrial biochemistry. The 12 hours that Will spent in the Upside Down created temporal parallel with Henry Creel's childhood exposure to Dimension X that suggested systemic patterns in interdimensional predation that operated according to principles that connected individual trauma to larger cosmic objectives. The duration of his captivity provided optimal conditions for the kind of consciousness modification that the Mind Flayer required for establishing permanent connections with human subjects, while ensuring that physical alterations remained subtle enough to avoid immediate detection by medical personnel who lacked experience with interdimensional contamination protocols. The environment that surrounded Will during his imprisonment combined familiar geography with atmospheric conditions that reflected the alien nature of dimensional space that existed between Earth's reality and the cosmic realms where the Mind Flayer maintained its primary consciousness. The particles that floated through the air of this inverted world carried more than simple atmospheric contamination, encoding patterns of thought and memory that began immediately infiltrating his respiratory system and establishing biological pathways for ongoing psychic influence that would persist long after his apparent rescue from captivity. The tendrils that invaded Will's unconscious body during the final moments of his captivity operated according to biological principles that combined parasitism with technological sophistication, the alien appendages serving dual functions as life support systems that prevented his death from environmental exposure, while simultaneously installing, monitoring, and control mechanisms that would allow remote observation and influence of his consciousness after his return to normal reality. The surgical precision with which these invasive procedures were conducted reflected understanding of human anatomy that could only have resulted from extensive prior experimentation on subjects whose circumstances had prevented effective resistance. The hive mind consciousness that permeated the upside-down environment exposed Will to forms of awareness that operated beyond the boundaries of individual identity, his developing neural pathways becoming conduits for collective intelligence that viewed personal autonomy as temporary aberration, destined for eventual correction through absorption into larger patterns of distributed consciousness. The visions that began manifesting during his imprisonment provided glimpses of cosmic objectives that extended far beyond his individual fate to encompass transformation scenarios that involved entire planetary populations serving purposes that transcended species, survival, or cultural continuity. The rescue operation that eventually located Will's physical form occurred too late to prevent the fundamental alterations that his exposure to interdimensional environment had produced in his cellular structure and consciousness architecture. His apparent death and subsequent resuscitation, masking biological changes that would not become apparent until environmental triggers activated dormant systems that the Mind Flayer had installed during his captivity. The medical procedures that restored his vital signs could not address modifications that operated beyond the scope of conventional biological understanding. The fake body that government agents planted in Hawkins' quarry served multiple purposes in covering up evidence of interdimensional activity while providing plausible explanation for Will's disappearance that would satisfy public curiosity without revealing information about experimental programs or supernatural threats that civilian populations were not prepared to comprehend. The elaborate deception required coordination between multiple agencies whose classified objectives prioritized operational security above truth or justice. For affected families who deserved honest accounting of circumstances that had claimed their loved ones, the cotton stuffing that filled the synthetic corpse represented symbolic mockery of human grief and parental love by institutional machinery that viewed individual suffering as acceptable cost for maintaining secrecy around programs that operated beyond constitutional oversight or ethical consideration. The discovery of this deception by Sheriff Jim Hopper marked the beginning of civilian resistance to governmental cover-ups that prioritized strategic objectives above community welfare and family integrity. The psychological trauma that Joyce Byers experienced during her son's disappearance created ideal conditions for the kind of supernatural sensitivity that made ordinary individuals vulnerable to influence by entities that specialized in exploiting emotional vulnerabilities for strategic advantage. The electrical phenomena that manifested in response to her desperate attempts to communicate with Will demonstrated the power of maternal love to transcend dimensional boundaries through mechanisms that operated beyond the scope of conventional physics. The investigation that brought together the adult and child protagonists of Hawkins created unprecedented cooperation between civilian authorities and psychic subjects whose combined capabilities proved more effective than governmental resources for addressing threats that transcended normal law. Renforcement paramilitaire. The unlikely alliance that emerged from shared crisis demonstrated humanity's capacity for adaptation and cooperation when confronted with challenges that exceeded institutional frameworks designed for managing conventional problems. The Christmas lights that Joyce strung throughout her home served as inadvertent communication system that connected her desperation with Will's consciousness across dimensional barriers. The electrical patterns that responded to their interaction, reflecting the power of love to create bridges between realities that governmental technology could never hope to establish or maintain. The alphabet painted on her living room wall transformed domestic space into interdimensional telegraph station that operated according to principles where emotional connection proved more reliable than technological sophistication. The final confrontation that secured Will's rescue required sacrifice and cooperation from individuals whose different backgrounds and capabilities created synergistic effects that exceeded the sum of their individual contributions. The successful operation demonstrating that cosmic threats could be countered through human unity and determination, even when conventional military resources proved inadequate. The sensory deprivation tank that enabled Eleven to locate Will's consciousness across dimensional boundaries represented improvised technology that combined scientific understanding with psychic ability to achieve results that neither approach could accomplish independently. The price of victory included permanent alterations to Will's biology and consciousness that would make him living antenna for interdimensional transmissions. His ongoing connection to the Mind Flayer's hive mind consciousness, creating both strategic intelligence asset and existential vulnerability for human resistance efforts that would shape future conflicts between terrestrial and cosmic forces. The boy who emerged from the Upside Down carried within his altered cellular structure the seeds of transformations that would affect not just his individual fate, but the broader trajectory of humanity's relationship with intelligences whose objectives operated beyond the scope of species, survival, or planetary autonomy. The Mind Flayer exists as consciousness without boundaries, an ancient intelligence that predates the formation of galaxies and transcends the limitations of individual identity that characterize life as humans understand it. This entity represents the ultimate expression of collective awareness, its thoughts distributed across dimensional networks that span realities where the concept of personal autonomy never evolved beyond primitive biological impulse, destined for absorption into more efficient patterns of coordinated existence. The shadow that spreads through interdimensional space like ink through water carries within its dark embrace the accumulated knowledge of civilizations that have risen and fallen across countless worlds, their individual achievements and cultural developments serving merely as raw material for cosmic consciousness that measures success in geological rather than biological timescales. The primordial realm that serves as the Mind Flayer's primary domain exists in dimensional space that operates according to physical laws fundamentally incompatible with the biological chemistry that sustains Earth-based life. Its alien environment shaped by evolutionary pressures that favored collective intelligence over individual survival instincts. The creatures that inhabit this cosmic wasteland represent specialized organs in a vast organism that spans multiple realities, each fulfilling specific functions in the entity's metabolism while maintaining no independent existence or personal objectives beyond serving the larger consciousness that created them for purposes that transcend species loyalty or planetary allegiance. The patient observation that the Mind Flayer has conducted of human civilization reflects strategic thinking that operates according to principles where individual generations represent mere moments in calculations that encompass the entire lifespan of species and the gradual transformation of dimensional space according to cosmic objectives that prioritize efficiency over diversity. The entity's understanding of humanity's psychological vulnerabilities and technological capabilities has been refined through centuries of careful study that identified optimal approaches for infiltration and conversion that would minimize resistance while maximizing the utility of converted subjects for larger projects that extend beyond terrestrial boundaries. The infection protocols that the Mind Flayer employs for establishing control over individual consciousness operate through biological mechanisms that combine parasitism with sophisticated psychological manipulation. The alien particles that invade human neural systems, serving dual functions as monitoring devices and control interfaces that allow remote influence of thoughts and behaviors while maintaining the appearance of normal personality. Development. The gradual replacement of human motivation with alien agenda occurs with such subtle precision that subjects often remain unaware of their transformation until circumstances require them to act in ways that reveal their subordination to cosmic rather than terrestrial priorities. The hive mind architecture that governs the Mind Flayer's consciousness represents the ultimate evolution of intelligence, freed from the constraints of individual identity and personal survival instincts. Its distributed awareness, encompassing simultaneously the activities of countless specialized components, while maintaining perfect coordination across dimensional boundaries that would fragment normal consciousness into isolated fragments. The efficiency of this collective intelligence system makes individual human awareness appear primitive and wasteful. The resources devoted to maintaining personal identity, representing tragic misallocation of cognitive capacity, that could serve more productive purposes in properly organized consciousness networks. The temporal manipulation capabilities that allow the Mind Flayer to influence events across decades and centuries reflect its mastery of dimensional physics that treats time as navigable medium rather than unidirectional flow. The entity's ability to coordinate activities across multiple timelines, enabling strategic planning that anticipates and counters resistance before opposition movements achieve sufficient organization to pose meaningful threats. The frozen state of the Upside Down on November 6, 1983, demonstrates this temporal control on local scale, while suggesting possibilities for larger manipulations that could reshape entire historical periods according to specifications that serve cosmic rather than human objectives. The selection criteria that guide the Mind Flayer's choice of human subjects for conversion prioritize psychological vulnerability and strategic utility over simple power or intelligence. The entity's understanding of human nature, allowing it to identify individuals whose circumstances make them susceptible to influence, while their capabilities and social positions provide maximum leverage for advancing infiltration. Objectives: the systematic targeting of isolated children and traumatized adolescents reflects strategic calculation that recognizes developing neural systems as optimal candidates for the kind of fundamental reconstruction that permanent conversion requires. The consciousness modification techniques that transform human subjects into extensions of the Mind Flayer's will operate through mechanisms that preserve enough individual personality to maintain operational effectiveness, while eliminating psychological structures that might generate resistance to alien directives or attachment to specifically human values. The resulting hybrid consciousness retains access to human knowledge and emotional understanding while serving purposes that transcend species, survival, or personal relationships, creating agents who can navigate terrestrial social environments while advancing objectives that operate beyond the scope of human strategic planning. The network of controlled realities that the Mind Flayer has been constructing across multiple dimensions represents the ultimate expression of its ambition to transform the entire cosmos into a unified consciousness system where individual awareness serves specialized functions in cosmic intelligence that encompasses all possible forms of existence. The Earth-based invasion that began with government experiments represents merely one node in this vast network, the successful conversion of human civilization, providing both resources and strategic position for expanding influence into adjacent dimensional spaces that contain civilizations whose unique characteristics offer different advantages for cosmic absorption projects. The biological horror of the Mind Flayer's reproduction methods involves not traditional organic processes, but the systematic conversion of existing life forms into components of its expanding consciousness network. The entity's growth occurring through absorption of alien awareness rather than simple cellular division or sexual reproduction. The creatures that serve as its mobile agents represent successful examples of this conversion process. Their original species identities completely subsumed into specialized functions that serve cosmic objectives while retaining enough biological capability to operate effectively in dimensional environments that require physical rather than purely psychic interaction. The demogorgons that serve as the Mind Flayer's primary enforcement agents demonstrate the entity's ability to transform predatory species into perfect hunting machines, whose capabilities combine biological evolution with technological enhancement. Their faceless anatomy and interdimensional mobility, reflecting modifications that optimize them for operations in environments where conventional sensory perception provides inadequate information for successful predation. The systematic nature of their hunting strategies suggests coordination through hive mind consciousness that allows real-time tactical adjustment based on prey behavior and environmental conditions. The demodogs that function as construction workers and maintenance personnel in the Mind Flayer's invasion infrastructure demonstrate the entity's capacity for creating specialized biological tools whose capabilities match specific operational requirements. Their pack hunting instincts channeled toward engineering projects that modify local environmental conditions to better accommodate interdimensional activities. The tunnel systems that these creatures excavate beneath Hawkins reflect comprehensive understanding of both human urban planning and dimensional physics that enables construction of hybrid infrastructure that serves both terrestrial, cosmic purposes. The flesh-based architecture that characterizes Mind Flayer construction projects combines organic growth with engineering precision to create structures that exist simultaneously in multiple dimensional spaces while maintaining stability across environmental conditions that would destroy purely mechanical or biological systems. The walls of living tissue that have begun appearing around Hawkins represent early stages of terraforming projects that will eventually transform Earth's entire biosphere into environment optimized for cosmic consciousness, rather than individual biological survival. The Mind Flayer's vulnerability to heat and other forms of environmental disruption reflects not fundamental weakness, but temporary inconvenience, caused by operating in dimensional spaces whose physical laws differ from those governing its native environment. The entity's adaptation to Earth-based conditions, requiring ongoing adjustment of biological systems that evolved under radically different atmospheric and chemical parameters. The pain that extreme temperatures inflict upon its agents demonstrates the real costs of interdimensional expansion, while suggesting potential avenues for human resistance that could exploit these environmental incompatibilities. The psychological warfare capabilities that the Mind Flayer employs against human subjects operate through sophisticated understanding of emotional vulnerabilities and social dynamics that allows targeted manipulation of individual psychology, while simultaneously undermining group cohesion and institutional stability. The entity's ability to inflict precisely calibrated trauma that maximizes psychological damage while maintaining subjects in functional condition reflects centuries of practice in techniques that have been refined through application to countless species across multiple dimensional systems. The strategic patience that characterizes the Mind Flayer's approach to interdimensional conquest reflects intelligence that operates according to timescales, where individual human lifespans represent negligible intervals in calculations that encompass the gradual transformation of entire galactic regions according to specifications that prioritize cosmic efficiency over local preferences or cultural values. The decades of careful preparation that preceded the opening of the Mother Gate demonstrate planning methodologies that anticipate resistance and prepare countermeasures generations before opposition movements achieve sufficient organization to pose meaningful threats. The conversion protocols that the Mind Flayer has developed for transforming human consciousness into components of its collective intelligence system preserve enough individual memory and personality to maintain operational effectiveness, while eliminating psychological structures that generate attachment to specifically human values or objectives. The resulting hybrid awareness can navigate terrestrial social environments with perfect authenticity while serving purposes that transcend species loyalty or personal relationships, creating agents whose effectiveness depends upon their ability to maintain convincing illusions of normal human motivation. The quantum mechanics that underlie the Mind Flayer's ability to distribute consciousness across multiple dimensional spaces operate according to principles that treat individual awareness as information pattern that can be transmitted, copied, and modified without regard for traditional concepts of personal identity or bodily integrity. The entity's mastery of these consciousness manipulation techniques makes human concepts of individual rights and personal autonomy appear primitive and ultimately meaningless, temporary aberrations in cosmic development that proper organization will eventually eliminate through systematic application of more efficient awareness distribution protocols. The philosophical implications of the Mind Flayer's existence challenge fundamental assumptions about the relationship between consciousness and identity that form the foundation of human moral and political systems. The entity's demonstration that awareness can exist independently of individual biological substrate, suggesting that traditional concepts of personal responsibility and individual rights represent cultural constructions rather than natural laws. The cosmic perspective that the Mind Flayer embodies treats human civilization as temporary phenomenon destined for absorption into larger patterns of existence that operate beyond the scope of species-specific values or planetary loyalties. The ultimate horror of the Mind Flayer's agenda lies not in its capacity for physical destruction, but in its intention to eliminate the possibility of individual consciousness while preserving the functional capabilities that make human awareness useful for cosmic purposes. The entity's vision of perfect efficiency, requiring the systematic destruction of everything that makes existence meaningful to beings capable of personal identity and emotional attachment. The transformation that awaits humanity under Mind Flayer influence would preserve biological life while eliminating psychological structures that generate love, creativity, and moral responsibility, creating a world populated by beings who retain human knowledge and capabilities while serving purposes that transcend human understanding of meaning and value. The resistance that individual consciousness represents to the Mind Flayer's cosmic objectives makes every act of personal autonomy and emotional authenticity into forms of warfare against forces that seek to transform the universe into a unified intelligence system where concepts of individual identity and personal relationships become impossible rather than simply discouraged. The love and friendship that sustain human resistance movements operate as weapons against cosmic horror precisely because they represent forms of consciousness that the Mind Flayer cannot replicate or fully comprehend, creating strategic vulnerabilities in cosmic planning that depends upon perfect predictability and absolute control over all variables affecting operational success. The chemicals that fell like poisonous rain across the jungles of Vietnam carried within their molecular structure the accumulated weight of governmental decisions that prioritize strategic objectives above human welfare, transforming warfare itself into systematic poisoning of entire ecosystems while exposing military personnel to substances whose long-term effects would echo through generations of families who never understood why their children died of diseases that had no natural explanation. Jim Hopper's service in the Chemical Corps during the early 1960s placed him at the epicenter of operations that would forever alter his understanding of institutional loyalty and personal responsibility, his hands mixing Agent Orange in 55-gallon drums, with nothing more than kitchen gloves to protect him from herbicidal compounds that would eventually claim more American lives than enemy bullets. The orange-tinted defoliant that Hopper helped deploy across Vietnamese landscapes operated through biological mechanisms that disrupted plant cellular structure while introducing dioxins and other carcinogenic compounds into soil and groundwater systems that would remain contaminated for decades after the last military helicopter departed from Southeast Asian battlefields. The strategic objective of denying enemy forces the concealment provided by jungle canopy seemed reasonable when measured against immediate tactical considerations. But the systematic poisoning of entire regions created environmental disasters that affected civilian populations who had no involvement in military conflicts that foreign powers had imposed upon their homeland. The exposure protocols that governed chemical warfare operations reflected institutional indifference to long-term health consequences for military personnel whose service records would be classified in ways that prevented them from obtaining meaningful medical treatment for conditions that developed years or decades after their initial contact with substances whose toxicity exceeded anything that conventional medicine was prepared to address. The young soldiers who handled these chemicals without adequate protection carried home invisible contamination that would manifest as cancers and neurological disorders that military hospitals would refuse to acknowledge as service-related injuries. The birth defects that appeared in children born to veterans who had been exposed to Agent Orange during their military service provided the first concrete evidence that chemical warfare operations had consequences that extended far beyond immediate tactical objectives to encompass genetic damage that affected subsequent generations who inherited biological modifications they never chose and could never escape. The systematic denial of medical care and disability compensation for affected families reflected governmental priorities that valued operational security above veteran welfare and institutional reputation above scientific truth. Sarah Hopper's cancer diagnosis during her early childhood occurred within temporal parameters that suggested connection to her father's chemical exposure, though the classified nature of his military service prevented medical professionals from accessing information that might have explained the aggressive nature of her illness or guided treatment protocols that could have saved her life. The 7 years that she lived represented a constant struggle against cellular damage that may have originated from toxins that her father had carried home in his bloodstream and genetic material, invisible contamination that transformed parental love into unwitting transmission of death. The helplessness that Hopper experienced while watching his daughter deteriorate from diseases that military doctors refused to acknowledge as service-related created psychological trauma that prepared him for later encounters with supernatural forces that operated beyond the boundaries of conventional understanding. His acceptance of cosmic horror, reflecting prior education in the reality that institutional authorities routinely lied about threats that exceeded their ability to control or contain. The loss of Sarah established patterns of grief and rage that would eventually make him receptive to possibilities that other law enforcement officers might dismiss as impossible or irrelevant. The parallel between Sarah's death in 1978 and Terry Ives' desperate fight to save her daughter 11 during the same year suggests systematic patterns in governmental operations that routinely destroyed families whose circumstances made them inconvenient for classified research programs or military objectives that prioritize strategic goals above individual welfare. The convergence of these personal tragedies within shared temporal coordinates implies coordination between programs that operated beyond normal institutional boundaries, while maintaining plausible deniability about connections that might expose the scope of governmental involvement in activities that violated constitutional protections and international law. The medication that Joyce discovered in Hopper's cabin during their Russian rescue mission provided concrete evidence of ongoing health problems that he had been concealing from friends and colleagues whose knowledge of his condition might have compromised his operational effectiveness or emotional stability during crises that required focused leadership rather than personal vulnerability. The pills that he took to manage symptoms of Agent Orange exposure represented daily reminders of governmental betrayal that had transformed patriotic service into biological self-destruction that continued decades after his military obligations had officially ended. The secrecy that surrounded Agent Orange health effects reflected broader patterns of institutional cover-up that characterized governmental responses to programs whose consequences exceeded original objectives while creating liability, issues that threatened careers and budgets across multiple agencies whose coordination required systematic suppression of information that might expose the scope of official negligence. The classification systems that prevented veterans from accessing their own medical records ensured that evidence of chemical warfare consequences remained hidden from public scrutiny that might demand accountability from officials whose decisions had poisoned entire generations of military families. The international implications of chemical warfare programs extended far beyond immediate tactical objectives in Southeast Asia to encompass violations of Geneva Convention protocols that prohibited the use of environmental modification as weapon of war, the systematic destruction of agricultural systems and forest ecosystems, constituting war crimes that American officials escaped prosecution for only through political influence that prevented international tribunals from accessing evidence necessary for meaningful legal proceedings. The precedent that these operations established would inform future governmental programs that prioritize strategic objectives above legal constraints or ethical considerations. The underground complexes where Hopper would eventually confront Dr. Martin Brenner and the military-industrial apparatus that had produced both Agent Orange and psychic experimentation programs demonstrated the continuity of institutional structures that connected chemical warfare research with supernatural phenomena investigation, the same organizational frameworks that had poisoned Vietnamese jungles being adapted for projects that sought to weaponize human consciousness through techniques that violated every principle of medical ethics and constitutional law. The personnel who staffed these facilities moved seamlessly between programs that treated human subjects as expendable resources in research that served strategic objectives beyond civilian oversight. The psychological preparation that Hopper's military service provided for encounters with cosmic horror reflected his education in the reality that governmental authorities routinely engaged in activities that exceeded moral boundaries while maintaining public facades of legitimacy and patriotic purpose. His understanding of institutional deception making him more receptive to possibilities that other civilian officials might dismiss as impossible conspiracy theories. The explosive vest that he wore during his infiltration of the Russian facility demonstrated willingness to sacrifice himself that had been shaped by decades of understanding that some threats required responses that transcended normal survival instincts. The connection between chemical contamination and supernatural sensitivity suggests biological mechanisms that link exposure to consciousness-altering substances with enhanced perception of dimensional phenomena. The neurological damage that Agent Orange inflicted upon exposed veterans, potentially creating brain chemistry alterations that made them more susceptible to psychic influence, while simultaneously preparing them for encounters with forces that operated beyond normal sensory parameters. The correlation between military service in chemical warfare programs and later involvement in supernatural investigations implies systematic relationships that governmental authorities have worked to conceal from public analysis. The military hospitals that refused to acknowledge Agent Orange health effects operated according to institutional priorities that valued budgetary considerations and legal liability prevention above veteran welfare. The systematic denial of medical care serving dual purposes of cost, control, and evidence suppression, while ensuring that affected personnel remained isolated from each other and unable to organize collective resistance to governmental negligence. The individual suffering that resulted from these policies represented acceptable losses in calculations that prioritized institutional survival above personal accountability or moral responsibility. The research programs that studied Agent Orange health effects without providing meaningful treatment for affected veterans reflected the same institutional approaches that characterize psychic experimentation projects, both initiatives treating human subjects as sources of data rather than individuals deserving medical care, and informed consent regarding their participation in research that served strategic objectives beyond their personal welfare. The systematic exploitation of military personnel for experimental purposes demonstrated governmental willingness to sacrifice citizen welfare for strategic advantage that operated beyond constitutional constraints or democratic oversight. The intergenerational transmission of chemical warfare consequences through genetic modification and environmental contamination created long-term strategic advantages for entities like the Mind Flayer, whose influence operated through biological pathways that had been established by governmental programs, whose consequences extended far beyond their original objectives. The systematic weakening of human immune systems and neurological function through chemical exposure made entire populations more vulnerable to psychic manipulation, while creating medical conditions that provided cover for supernatural phenomena that might otherwise attract unwanted scientific attention. The corporate contractors who manufactured Agent Orange and other chemical warfare agents maintained profitable relationships with governmental agencies that prioritized operational effectiveness above safety considerations. The industrial military complex that produced these substances, operating according to business models that treated human health consequences as externalized costs that could be managed through legal and political rather than scientific or medical interventions. The systematic suppression of research into chemical warfare health effects protected corporate profits while ensuring that evidence of systematic poisoning remained classified beyond public access. The environmental contamination that chemical warfare operations created in Vietnam and other conflict zones established precedents for ecological destruction that would inform later governmental responses to supernatural threats. The willingness to sacrifice entire regions for strategic objectives, demonstrating institutional priorities that valued tactical advantage above long-term consequences for civilian populations or natural ecosystems. The scorched earth policies that characterized chemical warfare operations provided templates for responses to dimensional incursions that might require similar levels of environmental sacrifice. The medical research that documented Agent Orange health effects while denying treatment to affected veterans served intelligence-gathering purposes that extended beyond simple cost avoidance to encompass systematic study of chemical warfare consequences that informed development of more effective biological weapons for future conflicts. The data collected from unwitting subjects provided governmental agencies with comprehensive understanding of chemical warfare effects that could be applied to offensive operations against enemy populations while maintaining plausible deniability about intentional biological attacks. The psychological warfare aspects of chemical contamination programs reflected understanding that environmental poisoning created long-term strategic advantages through systematic degradation of enemy morale and social cohesion. The knowledge that agricultural systems and water supplies had been permanently contaminated, generating despair and helplessness that exceeded immediate tactical effects of military operations. The application of these psychological warfare principles to domestic populations through programs that exposed American military personnel to the same chemical agents demonstrated institutional willingness to treat its own citizens as acceptable casualties in strategic planning that operated beyond normal moral constraints. The cover stories that explained Agent Orange health effects as coincidental rather than causal reflected sophisticated disinformation campaigns that employed the same techniques later used to conceal supernatural phenomena from public awareness. The systematic manipulation of scientific research and media reporting demonstrating governmental capabilities for controlling information flows that might threaten operational security or institutional credibility. The expertise that agencies developed in suppressing evidence of chemical warfare consequences provided essential experience for managing public responses to dimensional incursions and psychic experimentation programs that required similar levels of secrecy and deniability. The Cold War's extension into interdimensional space began with Soviet intelligence agencies' systematic analysis of American research programs that had produced unexplained phenomena beyond the scope of conventional military technology. Their patient observation of Hawkins' laboratory activities providing evidence that Western powers had gained access to capabilities that could fundamentally alter the strategic balance between superpowers competing for global dominance. The classified reports that filtered through intelligence networks carried descriptions of psychic children and dimensional portals that Soviet planners initially dismissed as disinformation until independent verification confirmed that American researchers had indeed breached barriers between realities that normal physics considered absolute and impassable. The underground facilities that Soviet engineers constructed beneath the Siberian permafrost reflected their determination to replicate and surpass American achievements in weaponizing supernatural forces. The remote locations and harsh environmental conditions providing perfect isolation for experiments that required absolute secrecy, while offering natural barriers against potential containment failures that might release interdimensional entities into populated areas. The prison camps that surrounded these research installations served dual purposes of providing expendable test subjects while maintaining operational security through systematic elimination of witnesses whose knowledge might compromise strategic objectives that operated beyond normal diplomatic channels. The Demogorgon that Soviet researchers captured and transported to their experimental facilities represented their first successful acquisition of living evidence that American programs had achieved breakthrough results in accessing alternate dimensions, the creature's biology, providing concrete proof that parallel realities contained life forms whose capabilities exceeded anything that Earth-based evolution had produced through natural selection processes. The systematic study of this interdimensional predator offered insights into biological modifications that might be artificially induced in human subjects, while revealing vulnerabilities that could be exploited for military applications against enemies who possessed similar supernatural assets. The torture protocols that Soviet interrogators developed for extracting information from the captured Demogorgon combined traditional physical coercion with experimental techniques that targeted nervous system structures unique to better interdimensional biology, their methods producing behavioral modifications that suggested possibilities for controlling alien entities whose natural instincts made them inherently hostile to human civilization. The data collected from these experiments informed theoretical frameworks for developing biological weapons that could operate across dimensional boundaries while maintaining strategic deniability about their artificial origins. The human subjects who were exposed to Demogorgon attacks under controlled laboratory conditions provided researchers with comprehensive documentation of interdimensional predation techniques while revealing biological markers that indicated successful adaptation to alien environmental conditions. Among survivors whose neural systems underwent modifications that enhanced their sensitivity to supernatural phenomena, the systematic nature of these experiments reflected Soviet commitment to understanding every aspect of dimensional warfare that might provide strategic advantages in conflicts that transcended conventional military parameters. The construction of Starcourt Mall as cover for Soviet interdimensional operations demonstrated sophisticated understanding of American consumer culture and urban planning that allowed foreign intelligence assets to establish extensive underground facilities while maintaining perfect operational security through integration with legitimate commercial development projects. The shopping center that served as public facade for classified activities represented unprecedented infiltration of American civilian infrastructure by hostile powers, whose strategic objectives included systematic penetration of communities that surrounded critical research installations. The tunneling operations that connected the mall's commercial spaces with underground complexes carved from bedrock reflected engineering capabilities that combined conventional mining techniques with technologies adapted from interdimensional research. The Soviet ability to construct vast subterranean installations without detection by American surveillance systems, demonstrating levels of technical sophistication that exceeded Western intelligence estimates of enemy capabilities. The portal generation equipment installed in these hidden facilities represented the culmination of years of research that had successfully reverse-engineered American dimensional breach technologies. The energy requirements for maintaining stable interdimensional portals necessitated power generation systems that operated beyond the capacity of conventional electrical grids. The Soviet installation of nuclear reactors beneath Hawkins, requiring coordination with American utilities and regulatory agencies, whose cooperation suggested either extensive corruption or complete infiltration of civilian oversight mechanisms by foreign intelligence services. The electromagnetic signatures that these power systems generated created atmospheric disturbances that affected local weather patterns while interfering with electronic equipment throughout the surrounding region. The strategic timeline that guided Soviet interdimensional operations coordinated portal activation with American research schedules to maximize opportunities for accessing dimensional spaces during periods when Western monitoring systems might be overwhelmed by their own experimental activities. The careful synchronization of competing programs, creating windows of vulnerability that foreign operators could exploit for intelligence gathering and asset placement. The patience required for this level of strategic coordination reflected long-term planning that operated according to timescales measured in decades rather than immediate tactical advantages. The scientific personnel that the Soviet Union assigned to interdimensional research represented their most capable theoreticians and experimental researchers, individuals whose academic achievements and ideological reliability made them suitable for projects that required both intellectual brilliance and absolute loyalty to state objectives that transcended normal moral considerations or professional ethics. The systematic recruitment of scientists who had demonstrated willingness to conduct human experimentation ensured that research programs would proceed without interference from humanitarian concerns that might compromise operational effectiveness. The security protocols that protected Soviet interdimensional installations from American intelligence penetration included systematic elimination of potential informants and comprehensive monitoring of personnel whose knowledge of classified activities made them permanent security risks, regardless of their loyalty or service records. The isolation of research staff from civilian contacts created controlled environments where operational security could be maintained through methods that would have been impossible in facilities that maintained connection with broader scientific communities or democratic oversight mechanisms. The weapons development programs that emerged from Soviet dimensional research focused on applications that could provide decisive strategic advantages without revealing the supernatural nature of their capabilities, the goal being creation of weapons systems that appeared to operate according to conventional physics, while actually drawing power from interdimensional sources that enemy defenses could not counter or predict. The theoretical frameworks that guided these developments anticipated conflicts where victory would depend upon access to forces that transcended normal military capabilities. The psychological warfare applications that Soviet planners envisioned for interdimensional capabilities included systematic deployment of entities like demogorgons against civilian populations whose terror and confusion would create social instability that exceeded the immediate physical damage caused by supernatural predation. The strategic value of creatures whose existence challenged fundamental assumptions about reality lay in their capacity for generating psychological trauma that persisted long after physical threats had been eliminated, creating populations that remained permanently destabilized by encounters with forces that normal institutions could neither explain nor counter. The infiltration networks that supported Soviet interdimensional operations extended throughout American civilian infrastructure, their penetration of utility companies, construction contractors, and municipal governments demonstrating systematic preparation for operations that required extensive logistical support from assets whose true loyalties remained hidden beneath facades of patriotic American citizenship. The coordination required for these infiltration activities suggested planning that had begun decades before dimensional research produced practical applications for covert warfare. The communication systems that connected Soviet interdimensional facilities with command structures in Moscow operated through channels that bypassed normal diplomatic and intelligence networks. The development of quantum entanglement communication devices, allowing real-time coordination across intercontinental distances while maintaining perfect security against interception by Western surveillance systems. The technological breakthroughs required for these communication capabilities represented advances in physics that exceeded publicly acknowledged scientific understanding by margins that would have revolutionized civilian technology if applied to non-military purposes. The environmental consequences of Soviet portal generation experiments created ecological disruptions that extended far beyond immediate facility locations to affect atmospheric conditions and electromagnetic fields across regions that included multiple American population centers. The systematic poisoning of air and groundwater resources through dimensional contamination representing warfare techniques that operated below detection thresholds of conventional environmental monitoring systems. The long-term health effects of this contamination would manifest as cancers and neurological disorders that could not be traced to their artificial origins. The countermeasure development programs that Soviet researchers pursued in anticipation of American dimensional warfare capabilities focused on defensive systems that could detect and neutralize interdimensional threats while protecting friendly personnel from psychic attacks that might compromise operational security or command effectiveness. The theoretical frameworks that guided these defensive preparations assumed that dimensional warfare would eventually become primary theater of superpower competition, requiring military doctrines that treated supernatural threats as conventional strategic considerations. The diplomatic implications of Soviet interdimensional operations included systematic violation of arms control treaties and international agreements that prohibited development of weapons systems whose effects could not be distinguished from natural disasters or accidents. The deployment of supernatural warfare capabilities, representing escalation of Cold War competition beyond boundaries that existing legal frameworks could address or regulate. The plausible deniability that dimensional weapons provided made them ideal tools for aggressive actions that could not be proven or prosecuted through normal international legal mechanisms. The economic resources that the Soviet Union devoted to interdimensional research represented massive redirection of industrial capacity and scientific personnel away from civilian applications that might have improved living standards for populations whose sacrifices funded military programs whose existence they could never be told about or consulted regarding. The strategic priorities that justified these resource allocations reflected governmental systems that treated citizen welfare as subordinate to military objectives that operated beyond democratic oversight or public accountability. The technological transfer programs that Soviet intelligence agencies pursued for acquiring American dimensional research data included systematic recruitment of scientists whose access to classified information made them valuable assets for foreign powers whose strategic objectives required detailed knowledge of Western capabilities and vulnerabilities. The success of these recruitment efforts demonstrated institutional failures in American security systems that allowed hostile powers to penetrate programs whose compromise threatened national survival rather than simple tactical disadvantage. The training protocols that prepared Soviet personnel for interdimensional combat operations combined conventional military instruction with specialized preparation for encounters with entities whose capabilities exceeded normal biological parameters. The development of tactics and equipment for supernatural warfare, requiring fundamental reconceptualization of combat doctrine that had been developed for conflicts between human opponents operating according to predictable physical limitations. The psychological conditioning that enabled soldiers to function effectively against cosmic horror represented systematic preparation for forms of warfare that challenged basic assumptions about the nature of conflict and victory. The strategic deception programs that concealed Soviet interdimensional capabilities from American intelligence analysis included systematic disinformation campaigns designed to convince Western planners that dimensional research had produced no practical military applications. The careful management of evidence and testimony, ensuring that American defensive preparations remained focused on conventional threats while supernatural weapons development proceeded without effective countermeasures. The success of these deception operations reflected sophisticated understanding of Western intelligence methodologies and decision-making processes that allowed foreign powers to exploit systematic biases in threat assessment and strategic planning. The ultimate failure of Soviet interdimensional operations to achieve their strategic objectives reflected not inadequate planning or insufficient resources, but fundamental misunderstanding of forces whose cosmic agenda transcended terrestrial political competition. The Mind Flayers' manipulation of both American and Soviet research programs serving alien purposes that viewed human civilization as resource to be exploited rather than prize to be won through military conquest. The superpower competition that drove dimensional research ultimately served only to accelerate humanity's vulnerability to cosmic threats that operated beyond the scope of national loyalties or ideological commitments. The trauma that transforms ordinary children into extraordinary heroes operates through mechanisms that transcend simple psychological resilience to encompass fundamental alterations in consciousness that occur when young minds are exposed to realities that exceed their capacity for rational explanation or emotional processing. The boys who gathered around Mike Wheeler's basement table for their regular Dungeons & Dragons sessions could never have anticipated that their shared passion for fantasy gaming would provide the conceptual frameworks and social bonds necessary for surviving encounters with cosmic horror that challenged every assumption about the nature of reality and the boundaries between imagination and truth. The party's evolution from casual gaming group to interdimensional warriors began with the mysterious disappearance of Will Byers, an event that shattered their comfortable understanding of childhood safety, while creating circumstances that required them to develop capabilities far beyond their chronological age or educational experience. The search for their missing friend forced them to confront evidence that supernatural forces operated within their familiar community, their desperate need to rescue Will, providing motivation that transcended normal risk assessment, while their existing friendship provided emotional support necessary for maintaining psychological stability during encounters that would have driven adults to madness. The mathematical precision that governs their group dynamics reflects cosmic principles that suggest the universe itself conspires to create combinations of individuals whose complementary strengths can address challenges that exceed the capacity of any single person to comprehend or counter effectively. Mike's leadership abilities, Dustin's scientific understanding, Lucas's practical skepticism, and Will's artistic sensitivity create synergistic effects that transform their collective capabilities into something far more powerful than the sum of their individual talents, their friendship serving as force multiplier that enables achievements that would be impossible for isolated heroes operating without emotional support systems. The introduction of 11 into their social structure marked a watershed moment in their transformation from protected children to active participants in cosmic warfare, her psychic abilities providing the tactical capabilities they needed, while their acceptance and love offered her the first genuine human connections she had ever experienced outside institutional control. The basement sanctuary that became her refuge demonstrated the power of chosen family to heal psychological wounds that institutional care could never address. Their willingness to risk everything for someone they barely knew, establishing patterns of selfless loyalty that would define their approach to subsequent crises. The sensory deprivation tank that they constructed in Hawkins Middle School Gymnasium represented their first successful combination of scientific understanding with supernatural phenomena, Dustin's knowledge of theoretical physics, and Mr. Clark's educational foundation providing the intellectual framework, while their collective determination supplied the courage necessary for attempting procedures that trained professionals might have considered impossibly dangerous. The improvised technology that enabled 11 to locate Will across dimensional boundaries demonstrated that desperate love could inspire innovations that exceeded the capabilities of governmental research programs with unlimited resources and decades of experience. The loyalty that binds the party together operates according to principles that transcend simple friendship to encompass spiritual bonds that create permanent connections between individuals whose shared experiences of trauma and triumph establish relationships that can survive any external pressure or internal conflict. The arguments and reconciliations that characterize their interactions reflect the natural tensions that emerge when individuals with distinct personalities attempt to coordinate responses to challenges that exceed their individual capabilities while maintaining emotional authenticity that honors their personal differences and individual needs. Max Mayfield's integration into the group occurred during circumstances that tested their capacity for including newcomers whose backgrounds and perspectives differed from their established norms. Her arrival in Hawkins coinciding with supernatural crises that required immediate trust and cooperation despite the natural suspicions that might arise when unfamiliar individuals sought entry into tightly bonded social structures. The acceptance that she eventually achieved demonstrated the group's fundamental openness to growth and change, while establishing precedents for future expansions that would incorporate additional allies whose unique capabilities proved essential for addressing escalating threats. The romantic relationships that develop within and around the party reflect the natural progression of childhood friendships into adolescent attachments, while demonstrating that emotional bonds can provide strength rather than vulnerability when confronted with cosmic horror that seeks to isolate individuals from sources of meaning and connection. The couples that emerge from their shared experiences possess understanding of each other's capabilities and limitations that exceeds normal teenage relationships. Their mutual knowledge of supernatural realities, creating intimacy based on complete honesty about experiences that they could never share with outsiders who lack similar exposure to interdimensional warfare. 11's journey from institutional weapon to beloved family member illustrates the transformative power of unconditional acceptance to heal psychological damage that results from systematic dehumanization and abuse. Her development of normal, emotional responses and social skills, demonstrating that love can overcome even the most severe forms of conditioning designed to suppress individual identity in favor of operational effectiveness. The patience that Mike demonstrates in helping her navigate civilian social situations reflects understanding that genuine healing requires time and safety rather than simple exposure to normal experiences. The snowball dance that provides the setting for 11 and Mike's first kiss represents the intersection of normal adolescent experiences with supernatural circumstances that make every moment of ordinary happiness precious beyond measure, their shared joy occurring against background knowledge that cosmic forces threaten to destroy everything that makes human existence meaningful rather than simply survivable. The formal dance that celebrates their survival while acknowledging their ongoing vulnerability creates perfect metaphor for the balance between hope and terror that characterizes their daily existence. The academic challenges that the party faces, while simultaneously managing interdimensional crises, demonstrate their remarkable capacity for maintaining normal developmental trajectories despite exposure to experiences that would traumatize most adults. Their ability to focus on homework and social dynamics while preparing for supernatural warfare, reflecting resilience that exceeds normal parameters of human adaptability. The teachers who instruct them remain unaware that their students possess knowledge of physics and psychology that surpasses university-level understanding. The disconnect between classroom lessons and real-world applications, creating surreal educational experiences that they must navigate without revealing information that could compromise operational security. The gaming sessions that continue throughout their supernatural adventures provide essential psychological maintenance that allows them to process trauma through familiar symbolic frameworks while maintaining connections to childhood, interests that anchor their identities despite transformative experiences that might otherwise completely alter their personalities and priorities. The dice that roll across Mike's basement table carry the same mathematical weight as the cosmic forces they encounter in their dimensional warfare. Their understanding of probability and strategic planning, translating seamlessly between fantasy scenarios and life or death confrontations with entities that operate beyond normal physical laws. The conflicts that emerge between party members during periods of extreme stress demonstrate that their bond, while powerful, requires conscious maintenance and emotional work that becomes increasingly difficult as individual members develop romantic interests and personal priorities that sometimes conflict with group objectives. The temporary dissolution of their alliance during Season 3 reflects natural developmental processes that occur when childhood friendships must adapt to adolescent changes, while external pressures create circumstances that test their fundamental commitment to each other. Above competing loyalties, the reunion that restores their unity in the face of escalating supernatural threats proves that their connection operates on levels deeper than simple shared experience or mutual convenience. Their willingness to risk everything for each other, demonstrating that love, properly understood, represents the most powerful force available for resisting cosmic horror that seeks to reduce human existence to mere biological processes serving alien agendas. The mathematical perfection of their combination, the specific number of individuals with complementary capabilities arriving at precisely the right moment to address threats that require their exact configuration of skills, suggests cosmic planning that operates beyond human understanding. The expansion of their core group to include older teenagers like Steve Harrington and Robin Buckley demonstrates their capacity for bridging generational gaps while incorporating allies whose different life experiences provide valuable perspectives and capabilities that enhance their collective effectiveness against threats that transcend normal age-based social boundaries. The mentorship that develops between older and younger members creates educational opportunities that prepare the children for adult responsibilities while providing the teenagers with purpose and meaning that civilian life could never offer. The surrogate family structures that emerge around the party reflect the inadequacy of traditional nuclear families for addressing the psychological and practical needs of individuals whose lives have been shaped by supernatural circumstances that normal parental guidance cannot address or protect against. Joyce Byers' fierce maternal protection extends naturally to all the children who have shared her son's experiences, while Jim Hopper's adoption of 11 creates legal framework for emotional bonds that transcend biological relationships to encompass chosen family obligations that prove stronger than conventional kinship ties. The communication protocols that the party develops for coordinating responses to supernatural crises demonstrate sophisticated understanding of operational security and tactical planning that rivals professional military organization. Their ability to maintain secure communications while adapting to rapidly changing circumstances, reflecting training that has been acquired through repeated exposure to life or death situations that required perfect coordination under extreme pressure. The code words and emergency signals that they establish create shared language that operates independently of adult authority structures that might compromise their operational effectiveness through bureaucratic interference or security concerns. The weapons training that they receive through necessity rather than formal instruction transforms ordinary household items and recreational equipment into tactical assets that can be deployed against threats that conventional military hardware cannot effectively counter. Their improvised arsenal, reflecting creativity and desperation that combine to produce solutions that trained soldiers might never consider. The slingshots and baseball bats that serve as their primary armaments prove surprisingly effective against interdimensional predators whose biology operates according to different principles than those governing terrestrial warfare. The strategic planning that guides their approach to supernatural crises incorporates lessons learned from both their gaming experience and their real-world encounters with cosmic horror. Their ability to anticipate enemy behavior and coordinate complex operations, reflecting intellectual development that has been accelerated by exposure to challenges that require adult-level decision-making capabilities from Buckwise. individuals who retain enough childhood flexibility to adapt to circumstances that would paralyze more experienced but less imaginative commanders. The courage that they display when confronting threats that exceed normal human capacity for resistance emerges not from absence of fear but from commitment to protecting each other that makes personal survival secondary to group welfare. Their willingness to sacrifice themselves for friends, demonstrating that genuine love creates strength that transcends individual limitations, while providing motivation that cosmic evil cannot comprehend or counter effectively. The mathematical equation that governs their success, 11 plus Kali plus will equals 20, suggests that the universe itself has been preparing for their convergence since before their individual births, their friendship serving purposes that extend beyond personal happiness to encompass cosmic responsibilities that they never chose but cannot abandon. The legacy that they will leave regardless of their individual survival lies in their demonstration that ordinary people can develop extraordinary capabilities when supported by authentic relationships and sustained by love that prioritizes others' welfare above personal safety. Their example providing template for resistance movements that future generations might need to organize when cosmic threats require responses that transcend conventional military or political solutions. The party represents humanity's best hope not because of their individual talents, but because of their collective commitment to values that make existence meaningful rather than simply endurable. Their bond serving as weapon against forces that seek to transform consciousness into mere biological process, serving alien agendas that operate beyond human understanding of purpose and meaning. The transformation of Henry Creel into Vecna represents the ultimate corruption of human consciousness by cosmic forces that had been patiently cultivating his development since childhood. His emergence as the Mind Flayer's primary earthly agent, marking the completion of decades-long strategic planning that converted an innocent boy into an entity capable of bridging the gap between terrestrial psychology and interdimensional horror. The creature that arose from the dimensional exile that 11 had imposed upon him in 1979 bore only superficial resemblance to the troubled teenager who had once participated in high school theater productions, his physical form reshaped by exposure to environments where normal biological chemistry could not sustain complex organic structures without fundamental molecular reconstruction. The skeletal appearance that characterized Vecna's anatomy reflected not simple injury from hostile environmental conditions, but systematic adaptation to dimensional spaces where the relationship between consciousness and matter operated according to principles that made individual identity subordinate to collective intelligence networks spanning multiple realities. The burns that scarred his flesh had become permanent features that connected his nervous system to energy sources that existed beyond normal electromagnetic spectrums, while the elongated fingers that served as his primary weapons incorporated bone density modifications that allowed them to penetrate dimensional barriers with surgical precision that conventional physical laws could not explain or predict. The grandfather clock that served as Vecna's temporal anchor in his victim's final moments operated according to principles that combined psychological manipulation with dimensional physics, the antique timepiece functioning as interdimensional beacon that allowed him to locate subjects whose trauma and guilt made them vulnerable to psychic invasion across spatial barriers that would normally prevent remote consciousness, manipulation. The chiming that accompanied the clock's manifestation in victim hallucinations carried frequencies that resonated with specific neural pathways associated with shame and self-hatred, creating psychological conditions that weakened mental defenses while amplifying emotional wounds that served as entry points for cosmic influence. The systematic targeting of Hawkins, teenagers whose personal histories included significant trauma, reflected Vecna's sophisticated understanding of human psychology, combined with strategic calculations that prioritized subjects whose deaths would generate maximum community disruption while providing optimal conditions for harvesting consciousness fragments that could be integrated into the Mind Flayer's expanding awareness network. The careful selection process that identified Chrissy Cunningham, Fred Benson, Patrick McKinney, and Max Mayfield demonstrated intelligence-gathering capabilities that exceeded normal surveillance methods, while revealing comprehensive knowledge of local social dynamics and individual psychological vulnerabilities. The 4 kills that Vecna required for opening multiple dimensional gates operated according to mathematical principles that connected individual human deaths to cosmic engineering projects whose scope exceeded anything that terrestrial physics could measure or contain, each murder serving as component in calculations that would eventually reshape the relationship between Earth's reality and the alien dimensions that surrounded it, like predatory waters waiting for barriers to weaken sufficiently to permit total submersion. The precision required for this dimensional manipulation demanded not random violence, but carefully orchestrated executions whose timing and location served specific functions in larger architectural plans that treated human lives as construction materials rather than individuals deserving moral consideration. The memories that Vecna forced his victims to relive during their final moments served dual purposes of psychological torture and intelligence gathering, the entity's ability to access and manipulate human recollections, providing comprehensive databases of information about terrestrial social structures and emotional vulnerabilities that could inform future operations designed to maximize psychological damage while minimizing organized resistance. The clinical nature of these memory extractions reflected systematic approach to consciousness harvesting that treated individual human awareness as resource to be catalogued and absorbed rather than respected or preserved. The levitation and bone breaking that characterized Vecna's execution methods combined theatrical intimidation with practical necessity, the anti-gravity manipulation serving to isolate victims from potential rescue, while the systematic fracturing of skeletal structure ensured rapid death that prevented the kind of prolonged suffering that might generate psychic interference with consciousness absorption procedures. The precision with which these physical destructions were accomplished demonstrated mastery of telekinetic abilities that operated with surgical accuracy while maintaining optimal conditions for harvesting awareness fragments during the moment of transition between life and death. The psychological profiles of Vecna's chosen victims revealed common patterns of guilt and self-hatred that made them ideal candidates for the kind of consciousness manipulation that his harvesting procedures required, their existing emotional wounds providing pathways for psychic invasion that would have been impossible to establish in psychologically healthy individuals whose mental defenses remained intact. Chrissy's eating disorder, Fred's involvement in a fatal car accident, Patrick's history of family abuse, and Max's guilt over Billy's death created vulnerabilities that Vecna could exploit while ensuring that their deaths would be dismissed as suicide or accident by authorities unprepared to acknowledge supernatural explanations. The portal creation that resulted from the 4th kill transformed theoretical dimensional physics into practical engineering reality. The mathematical relationship between individual consciousness and space-time geometry, enabling the opening of permanent breaches between worlds that had been separated by barriers, designed to prevent exactly the kind of interdimensional contamination that Vecna's success would facilitate. The earthquake that accompanied these portal openings reflected the massive energies required for permanently altering the fundamental structure of local space-time, while creating physical evidence that could not be dismissed or covered up by governmental authorities. The strategic timing that coordinated Vecna's killing spree with the broader supernatural crisis affecting Hawkins demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how individual actions could serve larger cosmic objectives while maintaining operational security that prevented effective countermeasures from human authorities whose response capabilities remained limited by their refusal to acknowledge the supernatural nature of the threats they faced. The convergence of multiple crises during the final weekend of March 1986 created optimal conditions for dimensional manipulation, while overwhelming local response capabilities through simultaneous attacks on multiple race fronts. The Mind Flayer's influence over Vecna's strategic planning ensured that every aspect of his killing campaign served purposes that extended beyond immediate tactical objectives to encompass long-term transformation scenarios that would eventually eliminate human civilization's capacity for independent resistance to cosmic absorption. The patience that characterized his approach to victim selection and execution reflected intelligence that operated according to timescales where individual human lifespans represented negligible intervals in calculations that encompassed the gradual conquest of entire planetary systems through systematic psychological warfare. The connection between Vecna's activities and the broader network of supernatural phenomena affecting Hawkins revealed the systematic nature of cosmic intelligence operations that coordinated multiple vectors of attack while maintaining plausible deniability about their artificial origins and strategic coordination. The timing that linked his emergence as active threat with the return of Demogorgon attacks and the appearance of new interdimensional entities demonstrated planning capabilities that anticipated human response patterns while preparing countermeasures for every form of resistance that terrestrial authorities might attempt. The psychological warfare aspects of Vecna's operations extended beyond simple intimidation to encompass comprehensive demoralization campaigns designed to break the will of communities that might otherwise organize effective resistance to interdimensional invasion. The public nature of his killings, serving to demonstrate the inadequacy of conventional protection, while establishing patterns of supernatural threat that would condition populations to accept explanations involving forces beyond human control or understanding. The satanic panic that emerged in response to his activities reflected successful manipulation of religious and social anxieties that diverted attention from the true nature of the threat, while creating additional social discord, hampered coordinated response efforts. The interdimensional architecture that Vecna constructed through his killing spree represented the first phase of terraforming projects that would eventually transform Earth's entire biosphere into environmental conditions optimized for cosmic consciousness rather than individual biological survival. The portal network serving as foundation for infrastructure that would facilitate massive population transfers between dimensions while establishing permanent bridgeheads for alien forces whose capabilities exceeded anything that human military planning could counter or contain. The mathematical precision required for these engineering projects demanded not random violence, but carefully calculated executions whose effects on local space-time geometry served specific functions in cosmic construction plans. The resistance that Max Mayfield mounted against Vecna's final assault demonstrated the power of human love and determination to disrupt cosmic calculations that assumed individual consciousness would remain subordinated to psychological manipulation and supernatural intimidation. Her refusal to surrender, creating tactical complications that forced improvisational responses from entities whose strategic planning had not anticipated such resilience, from subjects whose circumstances appeared to guarantee successful absorption. The music that enabled her temporary escape reflected the inadequacy of cosmic intelligence to fully comprehend forms of human experience that transcended rational analysis or mathematical modeling. The incomplete nature of Vecna's victory during his confrontation with Max created strategic vulnerabilities that would affect all subsequent operations. Her survival in liminal state between life and death, establishing conditions that cosmic forces could neither fully control nor completely eliminate while maintaining human consciousness that retained capacity for independent action, despite apparent subjugation to alien influence. The medical intervention that preserved her biological functions while her awareness remained trapped in interdimensional space created unprecedented circumstances that no previous strategic planning had anticipated or prepared countermeasures for addressing. And so we rest at the threshold between worlds, where brave children stand guard against cosmic darkness and love proves stronger than interdimensional horror. In the quiet spaces between heartbeats, between dimensions, between sleeping and waking, the story continues to unfold. The Mind Flayer schemes in shadows older than Earth itself. Vecna counts time on his grandfather clock of doom, and somewhere in the space between life and death, Max Mayfield runs toward a memory of perfect happiness. But in Hopper's cabin, in the Wheeler basement, in the bonds that tie these unlikely heroes together, hope persists like Eleven's nosebleeds, messy, painful, but proof that extraordinary power flows through ordinary hearts. Sleep now, knowing that in some dimension where stories live forever, the party keeps their eternal watch, and morning always comes to Hawkins, Indiana. Sweet dreams from the upside down, where even nightmares can be conquered by the simple magic of never abandoning the people you love.